But the intruder theory still raises many questions. If someone were in their home, how could John and Patsy Ramsey not have heard anything from their bedroom while their daughter was dying a violent death? A neighbor across the street reported hearing a fairly shocking child's cry between midnight and 2 a.m. Then why didn't John and Patsy Ramsey hear it as well?
In fact, that is exactly what the across-the-street neighbor, Melody Stanton, did assume. She assumed the scream had to have been heard, had to have awakened JonBenet's parents. In Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, it is described as only one scream, but it was horrifying. And she thought that it came from a child. So she heard the scream so loudly, so clearly, so distinctly, that she even thought that it came from a child. And I think we've got to think about the possibility. What if the Ramseys did hear the scream? What if Burke, who was on the same floor as JonBenet's bedroom, what if he heard the scream? Well, if they did and they woke up or they were alerted, well, then there would have been a lot of time to take some sort of action, wouldn't there?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I swear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So let's play devil's advocate. What if there was a scream? What if it was JonBenet's scream? And what if it was heard? Then what? Well, then there's the possibility that if it was heard at, let's say, as late as 2 a.m., then how much time was there to take some sort of action? Well, 4 hours between 2 a.m. and when 911 was called at 6 a.m. And when you think through this possibility, as I have when I wrote some of my books, one of the things you've got to consider is in the middle of the night, if you're going to write a ransom note, what are you also going to do? Well, you're going to need to turn on a light. And so did neighbors notice any lights on? And that's another narrative we need to go into. Besides the fiber narrative, the light narrative. And I actually saw, I think on Reddit, some folks telling each other how stupid I am because I don't know anything about lights or bedside tables and how they are different in America to South Africa. I don't know if you know this, but I've actually been to America. I've spent months in America. So I've also researched this case in a lot of detail, in particular this aspect dealing with the lights.
I'm sure you already knew that. That's what turns me on about you. Your attention to detail.
So how did the neighbors hear a scream and the Ramseys did not? And I think one way to get a sense of that is to stand there in the road, and I've done that, and look at the Ramseys' house and look across the road to the Stanton's house, and then imagine the sound traveling right across the road and into the house next door. And then ask yourself, well, is it reasonable that they heard something and that the Ramseys didn't? After all, the sound came from inside the Ramsey house, just like all the other evidence. And in order for it to reach the Stanton's home, it had to go from inside to outside to inside another house. And so if we just take this issue of the scream, does that support the intruder theory or does it support some other explanation? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, we're going to follow up this analysis with something else that is also really interesting. It is the polygraph narrative. We're going to go to the very swashbuckling interview on Larry King with Steve Thomas present and just have a look at this aspect again. And I think it's important to look at it within the context of certain things. You know, Patsy being asked about the fibers, this whole question about the scream, the whole question about did you write the ransom note? On all of these questions, we've got to ask the question, is Patsy telling the truth? So I will be posting an analysis on that following this later today, so look out for that. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started.
And that's a very good question to ask.
Smit says he has an answer, and it has to do with the unusual design of the Ramsey home. He says the parents would have heard nothing because JonBenet was murdered all the way down in the basement, 3 floors below. But how did a neighbor hear a scream that the parents did not? Smit points to a vent pipe in the basement boiler room.
Now, you might say that Lou Smit is a very good detective, is a very seasoned detective, but if you think about the evidence and the witness statements, increasingly he's got to twist himself more and more into knots in order to make sense of the actual evidentiary narrative, including this whole issue regarding the scream. Whatever the architecture of the Ramsey house, you are going to have to admit, you're going to have to acknowledge that it's unlikely people in the house where JonBenet was murdered wouldn't hear a scream if she did scream. And of course, one individual that they're leaving out of this whole story is Burke Ramsey. He's not on the top floor of the house. He is, in fact, directly above this vent. And so how can he not hear the scream that is traveling? Remember, his room, the windows of his room are facing the road. And guess who's on the opposite side of the road? The Stantons. And so isn't Burke's room the closest to the neighbors? And the other thing that you could argue is, did the scream definitely come from the basement, or could it have come from that part, just that side of the Ramsey home? And if that's the case, which room was the scream most likely to have emanated from, in order for the neighbors to hear it as clearly as they did? The other problem is that the Ramseys will say, as you heard, it's because the scream happened in the basement. But that sort of contradicts a vital element of Lou Smit's intruder theory, which is that JonBenet was stunned in her bed. And even that occurred, if that occurred without a scream, which is highly doubtful, the electric clattering sound of that machine would be very loud, almost deafening, in the dead of a silent Christmas night. Do you agree? Let's now go to the Bonita Papers, written in 1999, which deals quite extensively with this whole thing about the scream and Melody Stanton. Melody Stanton was interviewed by Detective Harry Hardcop on January 3rd, so 2 days after the Ramseys appeared on CNN and just over a week after the incident. So the memory would presumably have been fresh in her mind. Stanton lives across the street and one house to the south of the Ramseys, so actually diagonally across. Her bedroom is on the second floor of the west side of the house, which faces the Ramsey home. In other words, the bedroom is elevated. And so you could also think about the sound traveling horizontally, perhaps at the same level or more or less the same level. On Christmas night, Melody Stanton had gone to bed at about 10 p.m. Stanton always sleeps with the window slightly open, and on that night she had opened it 6 to 8 inches. She related that she had fallen asleep shortly after she went to bed, but was awakened by one loud, incredible scream. She related that it was obviously from a child, that is so significant, and that it lasted 3 to 5 seconds and then abruptly stopped. Just think about the detail. Loud, a scream obviously from a child, and then it lasted quite a long time, and then suddenly it was cut off. It appeared that the sound came from across the street south of the Ramsey residence. She did not look at the clock, but estimated the time at somewhere between 12 and 2 a.m. That also contradicts the time of death that the Ramseys sort of give in terms of JonBenet's tombstone, and this idea that the intruder had been in the house all along and had written the note in advance. This scream was so shocking that Stanton said she stayed awake and listened for any other noises for 5 to 10 minutes, but heard absolutely nothing after that. No cars, no voices, no footsteps, so she eventually went back to sleep. Stanton said she had not left on any televisions or radios when she went to bed. That's quite an important point. She admitted that she did not sit up in bed to look out the window, so she did not see any activity outside her window. Now imagine if she had. When asked why she had not come forward with this information right after the homicide, when detectives had canvassed the neighborhood, Stanton said she was so shocked by JonBenet's death that she at first did not make any connection to the scream. How unfortunate is that? Also, since none of the other neighbors had not mentioned to her about hearing a scream, she began to doubt she actually heard it. Also, an unfortunate way of thinking about it. In fact, when she told her husband, he said she had probably imagined it. It was Diane Brumfitt, a friend of Stanton's, who reported this incident to the Boulder police after her conversation with Stanton. Now, all of this made such an impression on me, this evidence, that the very first set of books I wrote on the Ramsey case I called The Craven Silence, largely because of this. Witnesses who heard her scream, who subsequently went radio silent. I mean, when has anyone heard or seen any interviews with the Stantons in the last 20 years? And by the way, her husband, Luther, also heard a sound that night, the sound of metal clanking on concrete. Now, I must say, if we think critically about this, the fact that she heard a scream but not her husband is definitely a little, perhaps, hinky. And also the fact that he heard the metal clanking on concrete but she didn't is also a bit strange. But if you put the two together, both of them heard strange noises late that night. I'm not going to take it further than that, other to mention just kind of a sad epilogue to this whole story. Did you know that Melody Stanton actually passed away in April last year, on April 12th? According to her obituary, she had courageously been battling pancreatic cancer for nearly 4 years. She was surrounded by her husband of 39 years, Luther, and then her children. Melody was born in Rushville, Illinois, and she had 4 siblings. She spent time working in television and advertising as a young adult, working in sales at national conventions in places like Atlantic City, Minneapolis, and Lansing before moving to Boulder, Colorado. That's where she met her husband, Luther. Melody had a passion for helping others, working first at the Presbyterian Manor for nearly 10 years before proudly co-funding Family Hospice and later Craft Home Health and Craft Hospice. In her free time, Melody loved to read fiction and historical novels about the Civil War. She always had a piano in the house, a love of music, which flowed from her mother through her and to all of those around her. She was passionate about cycling and traveling in her RV with her husband and their boxer, Happy. Melody always looked forward to birthdays when she would bike her age in miles. That would be followed by dinner at Jose Muldoon's or Rincon del Sol with friends and family. And I mean, Melody Stanton's death is just yet another person who is a vital witness to this case, who is now lost to the legacy of this case. It's too late now to talk to her. And so her memory is also one of those many memories associated with this case that simply fizzles away. So what do you think? Do you think the Stantons did hear a scream? And if you think about that, Lou Smit seems to acknowledge that they did, but then he provides an explanation. Do you think that Lou Smit's explanation is sensible, or do you think it's reaching? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.